Okay, well, I'm seeing that you all are out there, and we'll get a chance to walk through some of the key pieces of this week 5. Week 5, oh my gosh. You know, when we started off, there was only going to be 6 weeks, and so that means we're coming really close, which may be making you a little bit nervous, or maybe not. Maybe you're saying, I see the light at the end of the tunnel, I'm going to be able to make it, and that's great. So, but some of the key pieces tonight, I did want to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been reading through the Miller-McLemore book, They Let the Children Come. But probably most importantly, I want to touch on the main topics tonight would be looking at the genre of biblical literature called the poetic genre, or primarily found in the book of Psalms. And also then move back into our look at the letter to Philemon and get situated and set up for not only our assignments this week, but especially for beginning to transition to the signature assignment for next week. So, so that being said, let's start with the book of Psalms. How many of you, or I should say this, if you are somewhat familiar with the book of Psalms before you began reading this week, would you say I know some of the Psalms, I've heard the Psalms, I can even tell you a little bit of maybe one of them. Is anyone fall in that category where you know when we talk about the Psalms, you know what it was before we moved into this section of the class?
Yes.
I feel like they're the ones that are like, when you Google Bible verses, they're the ones that come up the most. You know,
Are they really? Okay.
I think so, like on Pinterest and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Dee Dee. You made
Hey, Dee
it.
Dee. Welcome.
I feel like those are the ones that I come across a little more, I think. Because I don't know.
So was it Sandra who said she was familiar with them prior to?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sometimes I can't see your face, Sandra, so I'm having to recognize your voice. So yeah, the Psalms, I think, well, maybe, okay, so Melissa, you said that you recognize Psalms from things like on Pinterest and what have you. That's a good place to find verses. You know, tell me a Bible verse about strength or about hope or about peace, and maybe it'll take you to a place and it'll give you one of the references will come out of the book of Psalms. Sandra, is that the same for you? What's your familiarity with it? Where does it come from?
Yes, I agree with Melissa for sure.
Okay.
It's interest, and then they pop out the most.
Yeah, so it's kind of a nice way that some of the social media items like Pinterest or you know, there's a lot of places where we begin to get a little bit of references to things in the Psalms. What you miss out when we do that, though, is you know, you're picking out a single verse out of what is intended to be a kind of a complete set thought, because what the Psalms are for us is they're intended to be kind of poetic in nature, but because they were written not in English, we miss out on a lot of the poetic aspects of it. Things that we would consider poetic, we don't see, but the Psalms are there. But for the ancient Hebrews, the Jewish people from 3,000 years ago, when these Psalms were being collected, written and collected and put into the order that they're in now, they were intended to be for the community, a way of expressing their heart at various times, and primarily in the use of corporate worship. It would be something that would help an ancient Jewish person to keep their sense of who they are in God, their identity as a community, but also for them to have something that they could share in worship, because worship became kind of a unifying feature for the community. So when everything else is pulling apart, worship becomes that which kind of holds our attention and draws us back together. And so that's what the Psalms were intended for. I'm going to just point out real quick, before I go to the book, but before the days of Pinterest, the Psalms were still familiar. It's just that we often got them in different times. Maybe it would be something you would see on a saying that someone had on their wall in their home, or perhaps you were at a wedding or a funeral, probably more than anything a funeral, where a psalm would be read. And quite honestly, probably Psalm 23, and maybe this is familiar to you, the psalm that begins, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters." That psalm is probably the most familiar of all of them. And again, there are 150 different psalms all packaged together in the book of Psalms. Again, each one with its own kind of purpose. You don't read one and then read the next because they build on each other. They're all 150 separate individual entities. And their purpose is to, again, give voice to the people as we express our prayers to God. So it's an ancient prayer book, and it functions like that, or it can function like that for us today as well. It doesn't have to be just something we read, clever Pinterest quotes. We can actually use the book of Psalms as a prayer guide for us as well. But in the book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, one of the things that Fee and Stewart said as they set it up, it is one of the kind of curiosities, kind of the unique features of the book of Psalms, and that's on page 212 is where I'm going to look at. It's the beginning of that section on the Psalms. Is that it has a unique place in the Bible, and also because of that, a unique set of rules for interpreting. Because instead of being what we often refer to as God's word for us, the book of Psalms, though it is in the middle of the Bible, is really our words to God. And so when you read the Psalms, you don't hear God speaking to us or hear a story where we see how, through the narrator's view, how God is acting, but we hear instead either notes of praise to God or notes of frustration because God seems not to be acting the way we expected him to, notes of discouragement because life has turned upside down, or maybe it's a psalm talking about how I once was lost, but now I'm found. There was a bad time and somehow God got me through it. And so now I can come around and say, I'm better for that hard thing that I had to walk through. So there's a lot of different types. And that's one of the beauties of the book of Psalms, is that, again, unlike probably any other part of the Bible, it really is intended to give our feelings voice as we interact with God. And so again, so what we're reading, sometimes things that you might read in the book of Psalms may not be very encouraging, or may not be even very accurate. The Psalm, I said 23 is probably the most famous. Another one that does get read from time to time is the Psalm right before it, number 22, where it begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? And again, that may not be true. You could argue theologically if God ever abandons his children, but the reality is that sometimes we feel like we've been abandoned. And so the Psalm is not to be used as proof that sometimes God abandons us, but the Psalm is there to give us a voice when we feel abandoned, or to make us feel not so weird, like somehow we're the only one that God has ever abandoned, or feel like God has abandoned us. And so they play a really different role for us. And we have to understand that, because there are some pieces in the Psalm, if you were to be reading through them, that might be a little shocking. You might say, that's not really how God is. And I would probably agree with you. That's probably true. And so we have to be able to read the Psalm and understand what they're there for. And that way we don't misinterpret them to be something that they were not intended to be. They're not intended to be a theology book. They're intended to be a group of prayers that help guide us in our prayers at different times in our life. Because sometimes, let's face it, sometimes everything is going well and we can be celebrating everything that's going on. Hey, I've got a birthday on Saturday. Woohoo! Isn't that great, Kayla? Yeah. Or sometimes you can feel like you've been hit by a bus because you're suffering with the COVID virus, and nothing in the world seems right. Everything seems to be put on hold or be put in jeopardy, and you can feel you can feel really kind of in a lonely place. And so the Psalms give voice to all those different times of life, and that's what they're there for. One of the things, and if you haven't yet seen it, you will watch a video this week, or a couple of short videos. It's from a long series. When I first started teaching this class, there was a set of teaching. A fellow named Walter Brueggemann did a series on the Book of Psalms, and it was really good, but it was like 3.5 hours long once you watched all 3 lectures. And that was just hard to fit into a week, saying that was going to be the bulk of your week is just watching those videos. So there's like 4 little snippets. You'll see it this week as you walk through your stuff. You'll see 4 little short videos. Each one's 3 or 4 or 5 minutes long. And it kind of gives you an overview of some of the different types of material that you'll find in the Psalms, different types of Psalms. Again, Fee and Stewart, they categorize the 150 different individual Psalms into like 7 different categories, but the Psalms don't come with their own categories. That's just us reading and saying, well, these are kind of similar in theme or style. Brueggemann only gives us 3 different styles, and you'll see that a little bit in the readings this week. He says they're either going to be Psalms of orientation, means they're Psalms that talk about how things are in our life. And again, the 23rd Psalm is a good example of that. This Psalm that says, the Lord is my shepherd. That's my orientation. I know who I am because I'm in relationship with my shepherd. All is well. He provides all I need. I have the green grass. I have the calm stream running alongside. And even though I walk through difficult times, the valley of the shadow of death, as the psalmist says, I fear no evil because he is with me. And so it's a psalm which speaks to us having being grounded in our right relationship with God, and our orientation is proper. But that's about 1/3 of the Psalms fall into that category. Psalms kind of like that. They're praise, they're thanks, they are Psalms just of speaking about being in that right place. And if you do hear a psalm read at church, it's likely to be one of those, because those are the ones that we would use as part of our corporate worship, because we frankly don't want to do psalms that make everyone depressed. And there are some psalms that would make you depressed. I think of like Psalm 88. It's a terrible psalm. I shouldn't say it's a terrible psalm. It's a perfect psalm for if you're feeling completely abandoned and like there is no hope in this world. But it's very depressing to read. So that would fall into that category, the second category that Brueggemann would call Psalms of disorientation. When the world is upside down, when we don't understand what God is up to, when we're struggling figuring out what my place in this world is, because it just doesn't make any sense. There are a number of Psalms, again, Brueggemann would call them disorientation Psalms, because they speak to that aspect of our life. And the third category that Brueggemann uses, and again, you'll see this in the videos, is a psalm he calls them either reorientation or a new orientation. And those are psalms that would, again, pick up that idea of, that not that this is a psalm, but that I once was lost, but now I'm found. That's a phrase or a part of a hymn that we sometimes sing at church out of the song Amazing Grace. And again, I point that out as a hymn because that's really what the Psalms are. The Psalms were, for the most part, written to be sung or prayed corporately together at a service at the temple. And so what we do today with music or hymns at church fit a very similar thing. There are things that we do together, which again, a psalm of reorientation would be the reason why we have to be praising God, because he has moved in our life and come to our rescue, or given us the path out of the distress we were in, who picked us up out of the miry bog and put our feet on the solid ground. Those are common type phrases that you would hear in a reorientation psalm. So as you read the Psalms or do the work this week, you'll see that those terms come up, and it's just they're external ways that we have to categorize the different Psalms that are there. So that's why when you're reading on Pinterest, you're probably going to be finding all the happy Psalms, and probably not the sad, depressing, gloomy ones, because that doesn't sell. But they are there because sometimes we're not happy. And sometimes even if we're connected in a relationship with God, life can still be challenging. And that's why the Psalms are there in their fullness and in their completion. Okay, how many of you had heard that Psalm, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd? Is that familiar to most of you?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say that is probably of all the Psalms easily the most familiar to most people, at least in our culture, and so it's a great one. I think it's about the most perfect Psalm there is. It really is. But sometimes you may not want to pray it, and so it's something. That's why there are 149 others that are there as well. So, any questions either on the Psalms or on the way that Fee and Stewart or Grimsroot referenced any of them? Okay.
I did have a question though on the 5.8 form.
Yes.
Let me pull it up on my screen so I can be precise in what I'm saying. I feel like part of the question is missing, and so I didn't know how to answer it. So the question states, what about the discussion in the article about the importance of lament in the healing brokenness? That's the question.
Okay, so and what's the number on that, Melissa?
5.8, the reflection form.
Okay.
It's like the last assignment before the test.
I went to it and they bumped me out. Okay, I'm going back to it now. Oops, that's not the one I wanted to go to. Would be a different class, not the right class at all. Okay, let me, I had my Moodle up and it went away from me, so 125.
That's okay. Technology never does what you want it to do.
No, it doesn't, darn it. Technology is always my enemy. Okay, so the question is about the article.
Yeah, it says, what about the article, or what about the discussion in the article about the importance of lament in healing brokenness? I feel like what am I supposed to be answering?
Very, very good. Okay, 5.8, that question references a article right before it on the Moodle. I don't, maybe it's not set up. If you go to your main Moodle page for this week, for number 5.
Yeah, I read the article, and it's about the young lady and how her mom abuses her.
Right.
And then she's asked to pray for a woman that she feels like has everything and anything that she could ever dream of. And she's wanting to be prayed, like the mom wants her to pray for this little thing. So am I answering it about what's the importance of healing it, of brokenness?
Yeah, the idea. Okay, so what is the phrase, the role of lament, which means, kind of airing your dirty laundry, all of your hurts or your grievances, but bringing them to God, not airing your dirty laundry to other people, because there are a number of Psalms that are that way. Again, those are the Psalms that, or one of the types of Psalms we'll find in those Psalms of disorientation. They're referenced as Psalms of lament, where they're talking about just, oh, woe is me. This is I'm in a bad place. Life has taken an ugly turn. There are things that have happened to me that there's no way I can see any good coming of it, but I'm going to pour out my heart to God through this prayer, through this lament, through this psalm. And so the question, I think, if I understand the question myself, and the reason for that article was the role of healing of her hurts before she's really able to move forward. And that's where the idea of lament comes in. that it becomes
Okay.
part of that healing. And so I think that's the question.
The question, because I feel like it was just like when I read it, I felt like the question was incomplete, so I didn't know how to answer it. But what you're saying is what's important of this? Like,
Yeah.
tell me why this is important. Okay, I can do that.
Right. Yeah, the importance of that aspect of the lament in that healing process when there's that kind of really jagged brokenness that's still there in our lives. You know, how does the lament begin to help with that healing so they can get to a new place?
Yeah, I thought that article was amazing. I actually
Yeah.
enjoyed reading it in entirely, and I could relate to her situation on many different levels. So I feel like that was like, you know how you read something, you're like, the Lord wanted me to read that.
Yeah, it fits
That was-
me. Yeah, it hits me and it helps me. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of those.
Good.
Thank you for answering that.
Oh, you're welcome. Absolutely. Thank you for asking. So, but yeah, that's one of the challenges, what is the role when we're dealing with brokenness? It's easy to think about these Psalms, the happy Psalms, the give thanks to the Lord for he is good. His love endures forever, Psalms like that. Those are wonderful when things are going well. But sometimes things aren't. And so that's the role of the lament. How does that factor into our healing time? So yeah, thank you for asking, and hope that's helping clarify a little bit for the others too, who maybe if you haven't gotten to 5:8 yet, but you will be. So
weekend.
Yeah.
With no work.
On the weekend when you have a little more,
so late.
when you got some more time.
Didn't read too much anything.
Yep. I get.
Yes. Sorry I get so ahead of you guys, but I got race season's coming up. I'm trying to get my race car ready, girl. I got motor swaps to do a whole weekend.
Well, we doing the best we
Don't
can.
apologize. Don't apologize. We come to you when we need help.
Let's get this done.
You got the time. You go ahead and do it, girl.
Yeah.
Some of us don't have all the time.
I know. I'm like, Melissa, how do you do this?
Exactly.
Yep.
Just call me. I got you.
I appreciate you.
Really?
You do what you got to do.
Well, I'm calling. I always say that, but I don't. But anyway.
Well, call Melissa. And Melissa, I want to say thank you. I know you caught. You checked me on something. We do have a reading quiz this week also, and and it wasn't functional. Actually, it had not been set up or hadn't been opened up yet. So and it was fully functional. It just wasn't in a place of being operational. So thank you, Melissa, for asking. It was a real easy fix. Even I could fix it, which is really remarkable. But yeah, so we got that going. So you'll find that at the end of the week. And again, just as I've said before, when you come across something that the numbers don't seem to jive, like for example, going from that forum on lament 5.8, the next thing you see is 5.11. That's the quiz. Don't worry about 9 and 10. If it's not there, don't worry about it. So so just jump right over it and then do the quiz. The quiz is on the vocabulary that you'll find in your syllabus. It's on like page 4 of your syllabus. There's a list of words, and most of which we have covered we've covered in class. Sometimes they are only touched on the book, but for the most part, they're there. And you have a set amount of time, and then you have 2 opportunities. You can take the test twice. It randomly switches up the words. So you can take it twice, and then it selects the one that is your best score to be put into the grade book. So it's pretty simple. Melissa, did you get a chance to have a look at that?
Yeah, I didn't do too good on it. I got my best score was a 20 out of 30. I just run out of time. It happens really fast. Because I'm like scrolling up to see the words and scrolling down to see the definition and scrolling up to make sure I'm spelling it right and scrolling right down. It was kind of difficult. But
okay. Well, I appreciate you getting for and being, and I hope everyone's hearing that frustration so they know what to expect and they know the time frame is rather tight, and so come prepared for it and be as studied up as you can. That will help.
There's a list of the words after the quiz. It comes on after the quiz, and you can just print it out and study them.
Yes.
So is it like, is it
Yeah, and
true or
thank you.
false? Pick the right one or?
Yeah, no, it's matching. And so,
Okay.
yeah, so what the best way to go at it is to go, you're right, mostly go to that the next click on there's a Word document that has the words as well as the definitions that are there. And go ahead and take a look at that, but I ask not to use it while you're doing the quiz. That kind of defeats the purpose of the quiz. And I'm going to have to
Right.
just, I put it on there in trust that you guys would utilize it the proper way, because otherwise it saves you having to kind of discern what the right definition is, or then if you get a definition but it's not the one that's going to match up with what's on the quiz, then you may not be able to figure it out. So this just helps. So it streamlines your study time, but again, use it only for studying. And I appreciate that. And then turn to the quiz and just get after it.
Well, it's obvious I didn't use it because I didn't get a good grade.
Well, I'm sorry. Maybe I should move that where it comes in front of the quiz terms instead of the following it.
I did study them. It's just the definitions are not word for word the same, and you kind of got to know the overall meaning of the word. And some of the words I didn't know the overall meaning of, so it kind of I struggled with those ones, but it wasn't that bad.
Yeah. So okay. So again, prepare. Look at that Word document. That'll help. And then, yeah, just be aware that you've got 2 shots at it, but they are both timed. And so do the very best you can. And also realize that it's only, I shouldn't say only, but it is 30 points, which is not life and death. Very, very rarely do grades swing very far on just 30 points out of the nearly 1,000 that you have in this class. So it is something to kind of grade how some of the different words that maybe you've learned that you didn't know before, but it's not a real big piece of your overall grade. So don't let that scare you off. Okay. Okay. Then let's do this before we'll wrap up with Philemon. I do want to talk a little bit about the Let the Children Come. Because I took one of the assignments out. I thought it was not necessarily something, but I wanted you guys to have a chance to read it. And I hope you've had a chance to read through that chapter. Was it chapter 5? Yeah, 5.
Yes, it was 5.
And
Let the children come.
yeah, it's the one by Macklemore. And
I'm so tired and so sleepy. So I sat outside at work. I sat outside where it was cold so I could stay woke.
that keeps you awake, doesn't it?
I was like, I'm gonna sit out here. If I sit someplace else, I'm going to sleep. So
Yeah.
I sit out in the cold.
Well, good for you. I'm glad you're doing it. In my book,
I'm on break.
well, good. You got to do it when you can do it.
Exactly.
Yeah, in my book on page 126,
What chapter is it?
it's chapter 5.
Oh, okay. The one that I read last
Yes,
week.
yes. And now we're going to talk about it.
Okay, good.
You
I
know,
read
there
it.
was an interesting, I think it's interesting, and it's an interesting piece of Macklemore's bigger picture about one, how has biblical Christianity affected our culture? 2, how does it interact with psychology, and specifically, how does it interact with her kind of feminist brand of seeing the world through her feminist lens? And she was talking about the idea of self-sacrifice kind of being the primary goal of Christian theology through the years, the idea of giving oneself up, using Jesus as the example. And then that's something that we then as humans follow his example. And so much of our role is to be sacrificial, not to be selfish. And yet that has and she was suggesting, one of the things they were suggesting here, both from a psychology point of view, as well as her feminist point of view, was a different goal that she referred to as mutuality, and where each relationship kind of gets, colored through that lens, not who can outgive the other, who can be most sacrificial, but how can we grow towards a mutual relationship? But on that page 125, 126, it did talk about some of the challenges we have, especially in dealing with kids who are not fully formed adults yet. And so the challenge, if I understand her right, the challenge that she's going at is how do we then both parent as well as operate as teachers when our goal is not to be self-sacrificial, but to move towards a mutual relationship, or a relationship of mutuality. Did you guys have enough of you had a chance to get through that section of that chapter 5 that we could have a little conversation about that and just see? Because one of the things that's interesting is that if you take that seriously, then what do we do? How do we do that with our kids? And part of that, I think she said, part of that is that we, kind of live in hope. On page 127, she said, from the beginning, loving care for our children involved the hope and the expectation that the giving would become more mutual. And so as kids grow up and as they begin to, move towards adulthood, the hope is that instead of being quite so one-sided in the relationship, the caretaking relationship of parent begins to shift. And it's kind of like you do that for the time in hopes of it becoming more mutual as you go forward. But what does that do? If you're a teacher, how do you factor that in if you're only with this student for, say, a year? How do we see that? Or is that something that we can even strive for? Which I think is part of the question that Miller-McLemore brings up.
What's the title of the subsection?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Sacrificial. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Sacrificial love for children, which is the beginning of, actually, it's the children as the labor of love, which then moves into the sacrificial love for children. And
Yeah, I found it. In my book, it's on page 105.
Okay. It's a little bit.
So in the green one.
Green one. Yeah. A little bit different. And it just goes for, okay, so 105, probably 105 to about 109. There's only a few pages where we really dial into this idea of the aims of mutuality and how we can see that in the way of interacting with kids, especially in the educational system, or in how we can implement that in our classrooms. Any ideas? Go ahead, Kayla.
So is it asking in the reading, was it asking, I'm trying to remember right now. Sorry.
That's okay.
It was asking in so many words from my understanding, like how do we impact children in a small amount of time, pretty much,
Yeah.
within our home and within our in our workplace.
Yeah, it talked on that, but again, it was almost a little bit of a tension between, when we think about being a parent, often we think about what we pour into our kids, right? The idea of being willing to sacrifice for our kids because we're giving of ourselves for their betterment. But at what point in that child's life do we begin to see that it becomes, or maybe it's right away, how do we begin to see a sense of give and take, where it's not just give, and how do we incorporate that? How do we begin to, give for our students, but at the same time, how is it, or where do we see the students beginning to give back to us in a more mutual relationship instead of being a one-sided relationship?
I feel like as just an individual and a teacher as well. So we do foster care. We may get a child for 5 days or 3 years.
Wow. Yeah.
So impact is a big thing in my household. You have to impact the child and fill them up from the minute they get into your life. So even as a teacher, you try to impact the minute, your student comes in your class, you say, hi, how's your day? How you doing? You greet them, you teach them how to have personable, I guess, an attitude towards others. You try to teach them good manners. You try to teach them, this is how we treat others. Also in the Bible, it says, how we're supposed to treat others and how we would like them to treat us, you know.
Right.
So just my parents always say, you know, leave a seed in them so that it may be able to blossom over time. You may not be able to see it in that in that time that you have that child, but in time, someone's going to keep watering that little seed inside them. It might be something small, but you leave an impact in the time that you have them. So I've seen that, you know, we've had kids come in my household that have been there 3 days, 2 days, but you know, that newborn that we got from the hospital, you know, they may have drug defects, you know, but you know what, the time that we had them for 3 days, guess what? They were fed, they were changed, they were loved. And in that 3 days, we give them to whoever who's next, you know. So impact in the small amount in time doesn't matter, and that seed will eventually grow. And yeah.
Are you still involved in the foster care, Kayla?
Yeah, I actually
really?
have. Yeah. So we have a little girl. We had her since she was 2 weeks old, and she's about to turn 3 in July. We have her brother. We got him when he was 4 days old, and now he is 1 year old. In January.
That's a lot of lives to be able to impact, and yeah, getting the time to really lay that foundation when they're so little.
Yes, definitely.
Well, that's awesome. Anybody else? Any interaction either around that idea of mutuality or anything else really that kind of comes to mind, especially with Miller McLemore as kind of our background of chapter 5 for this week?
I feel like I don't know how to say it, like you put in your work as a mom, as a teacher. This chapter kind of was hard for me to read because I don't like being segregated. So I don't like being put aside from what men are capable of doing. Me and my husband have always been like, women are capable of doing things that men do, and men are capable of doing things that women do. And that's always how our relationships have been. But I feel like you get out of a relationship what you put into it. So women put in a lot of effort emotionally into children. And as they get older, that emotion comes out of them. And you see the good that you've instilled in children, and you see the hard work that you've instilled in children. And I get a sense of pride out of it. And I feel like, I think that's what she's trying to say here, right? She's trying to say like,
yeah, I think you're right on it. Maybe you were arguing something that's not there a little bit, because I think you're exactly right. That's what she was saying, is that we value that idea of a mutual relationship, the man and woman, where they are both equally capable, and you just bring out the best in each other, but you're even, you're equals. And so it's a mutual relationship, but it's different. And if that is the ideal, it's different with kids, because kids aren't, you know, it's especially little ones like Kayla's talking about, a 1-year-old or 3-year-olds, you know, they're not the same way able to, you know, interact or give back in the same way that a fully formed adult can. And so that becomes a little bit of a challenge. How do that's her point, I think, is, so if that is something that we're striving for, not a one-way relationship, but a mutual two-way relationship, how do we work that into how we raise kids? How do we work that into how we educate children? Who, again, most of those kids we educate aren't going to be fully formed adults either. And so what do you do in the classroom, perhaps, that could foster that a little more intentionally?
I think that it only takes one good person to really spend the time with a child and influence that child and show that child really where they're coming from, So like me, for example, I came from, my dad was abusive, my mom was single mom my whole life, my dad was in and out, druggy, alcoholic. But I had that one teacher in school, that even though I thought I wasn't worth it, told me I was, and pushed me and pushed me and pushed me. Even at a young age, I feel like positive interactions with children create positive moods in children, and they create positive outlet. You have to just give them you have to give a child the tools and teach them how to use them so that when they get old enough to use them, they're prepared to use them. So I feel like that's my argument there. You muted yourself, John.
I did, and so yes, I did. Thank you. And I think that's kind of the second level thinking that I think she's asking us all to do is so how do you build those things in so that as the child grows, that mutuality and the relationship grows also. It doesn't stay stuck in a one-way relationship. Yeah, how do you do that so that you can be intentional about that, both whether it be in the classroom or in the home environment? Because it's important, isn't it? I mean, that's, to think about having a little life that you're impacting or you're influencing, a little life that's going to become a full-grown human adult life. That's a big responsibility.
That's funny that you bring that up, because I was just having a conversation with my daughter today about how decisions that she makes affects other people and how she needs to be a contributing member to society. She goes,
Yeah.
Mom, why can't I just quit school at 3rd grade?
Yeah.
I already know everything. I said, you know everything? She says, yeah, I know everything. I don't need to learn anymore. I'm smart.
Oh,
I said, oh, well, I said, I can drive you down over here on the bridge and I can show you where the 3rd graders that dropped out live.
yeah.
And that, but you got to
Yeah.
tell her, you can't really drop out of school at 3rd grade. You got to build a little more tools than that,
Yeah. But it's interesting that she's thinking that way already. It's almost like, hey, I'm ready to contribute. I'm ready to be fully functional myself, even though I'm only 8 years old or whatever. So
Yeah, and I'm like,
yeah.
there's many tools that you still don't have. Like you don't know, how to read people and understand politics. And I started rambling about how all this is just leading up to a greater good. And she
Yeah.
kind of was like, okay,
She's
Mom,
like-
I'm going to go to school.
Yeah, yeah, she probably checked out. I don't need to hear this. I don't understand what you're talking about, and I don't care. So
I think in the classroom too, I think with little children, I usually try to make sure everybody respect and get to know each other, and each other's likes and dislikes, and to be respectful of that. So I like to also go by through culture,
Mhm.
what is your ethnicity? What can you contribute, and just try to I think the more we know about each other, even the children, I think they'll have more love and more concern when that's brought together. So I think that's important to show in the classroom. Love and concern, and
yeah.
I think that when we praise children, I think it's something they learn to do also. I think, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Dita, I think that's a good, maybe another.
Am I all on the wrong field?
No, you are. No, I think you're on it, and I think that's another one of those second step ideas that is really not addressed in the book specifically. But yeah, how do you role model as a teacher? How do you role model or bring out, create an environment where there is that kind of respect, so that even the kids, as they interact together, it's not a one-way conversation. Right. It's not like someone gets everything and everyone else has to kowtow to that. But there's a you're developing their habits too, of how they can treat one another with mutuality and respect, and see the strength that another has, recognize that they don't have it all, because that's the challenge, I think, for little kids, isn't it? That they have a hard time seeing beyond themselves. But
Right.
That's an important piece of getting along in this world, is being able to recognize that no one person is complete by themselves, and no one person is perfect by themselves. But we need one another, and there's a requirement of to be healthy and happy in this world. You're going to have to be able to get along with other people and value what other people have to offer.
Exactly.
That's the challenge of that mutuality model that Bonnie McLemore is talking about there. But again, she doesn't deal with that directly, but I think that's a jumping off point for that kind of thought. How do I do that? How do I model that? How do I encourage that? How do I teach that to these little students who are going to have to become, if the world's going to get better, are going to have to become little mutual people, getting along and seeing the good in others. Well, good, interesting. I want to just I'll move off this, but I'll just say, how have you guys liked it? Because we haven't talked too much in our Zoom sessions. Usually if we were in class 4 hours a night, we would do a little more interacting as a group with the Macklemore book. And sometimes I find that classes love this book. It's like their favorite piece of the class. And other classes find this book, a little heady, a little too psychological, and not really up my alley. So how have you guys, how has this book played for you guys?
Some chapters I love, and some chapters I'm like,
Yeah.
The feminist chapter wasn't one of my favorite chapters. I feel like it just doesn't align with my ideals, and I mean it's someone else's ideas, and you
Right.
read them, but it was hard for me to read. I was mad probably halfway through it. There's a lot of angry faces and question marks, and I think, but like the first couple of chapters, I enjoy reading them. I think as you get more deeper into the book, she gets more deep,
Yeah. How about you, Dee Dee? I saw you kind of shaking your head.
So it's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Some of it, I don't know.
It's not as good as God's healing strategy. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
Right.
All right. Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, and again, every person probably says, "Oh, I really like this book." Whether it be a class by class or just person to person. Some are going to like healing strategy. Some are going to like reading the Bible for all it's worth. Some are going to like Let the Children Come, and that's just, again, depends a little bit on your perspective and what's scratching your itch. But yeah, it's an important piece for us, especially in the education aspect for this class. So
I think the healing strategy is easier to read.
Mhm.
I feel like and Let the Children Come, there's a lot of words that I have to not quite in my vocabulary. I do feel like How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I feel like this is the book that I benefit from the most in the class. I feel
Right,
like
me too.
I feel like if we didn't have any other of the books besides the big red one and I only had this one, I feel like the class could just be, taught just as well. You muted yourself again.
Did. Okay. I was just making sure that my dog didn't get into the show here tonight. So yeah, and you know what? If it was just me teaching a Bible class, I think we could get by with just using with that book because I think it really is helpful, and it gives you some tools to better understand the Bible as a whole. So it is good. Okay, so tonight though, I do want to take a little bit of time. We've already touched a little bit on our Moodle for this upcoming week, but I do want to talk a little bit about the book of Philemon again, because I think that's a key piece as we move forward. And I hope you've had a chance to look at the literary world and contemporary world assignments. But if you haven't, we're not going to get over too deep into them tonight. Just want to touch on it a little bit, but follow up a little bit with the historical world. And I intended to have the historical world papers graded and recommendations or input, given a little bit of feedback for you, but I didn't. So tomorrow is going to be my promise to get at least that one back. And if you've had a chance to get the others in, I will try to get on those so you get a little bit of feedback as well. But let's take a look at Philemon ourselves tonight. And so where's my Philemon? Maybe I'll pull it up here again. And just follow along with me as I read it for you. And then we want to go back and just kind of touch on a little bit. So let me get Philemon. There you are. And I'm going to read it tonight. I'll put it up on our screen, but we'll do it in how do I want to do that? Not just that one. I want to go to the whole. We'll do it in a way that allows us to read it in a different version. So this is not going to be the new Revised Standard Version of our Red Bible. I'm going to put on the screen the New International Version, which is a little bit easier to read, but it's not too loose that we lose the meaning of it. So there it is. Let me get to my share screen. Here we are. Okay, share. Okay, so in the New International Version, it reads a little bit different than our Big Red Bible, but you're going to see that most of it's the same. And again, a lot of it is going to be similar certainly in the names are going to be the same, but it does read just slightly differently. You may or may not notice the difference, but I'll read it out just so we can hear it tonight, and then talk about some of the questions that we have in our historical world as well as the literary world perspectives here. So in verse 1 begins with his introduction. Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, to Philemon, our dear friend and fellow worker, also to Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church that meets in your home. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I always thank my God as I remember you in my prayers, because I hear about your love for all his holy people and your faith in the Lord Jesus. I pray that your partnership with us in the faith may be effective in deepening your understanding of every good thing we share for the sake of Christ. Your love has given me great joy and encouragement, because you, brother, have refreshed the hearts of the Lord's people. Therefore, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do, yet I prefer to appeal to you on a basis of love. It is as none other than Paul, an old man, and now also a prisoner of Christ Jesus, that I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, who became my son while I was in chains. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become useful both to you and me. I am sending him, who is my very heart, back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel. But I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favor that you would do, would not seem forced, but would be voluntary. Perhaps the reason that he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and a brother in the Lord. So, if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will pay it back, not to mention that you owe me your very self. I do wish, brother, that I may have some benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Christ, confident of your obedience. I write to you knowing that you will do even more than I ask. And one more thing, prepare a guest room for me, because I hope to be restored to you in answer to your prayers. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends you his greetings. And so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. The grace of the Lord Jesus be with your spirit. Okay, I want to stop my share there and come back to you. Okay, so that is the letter of Philemon, written by Paul to his friend Philemon, about another individual whose name is Onesimus. So just from your recollection of maybe the assignment from last week, a couple things quickly. What do you think of when you hear about the idea of slavery in the ancient world, especially the Roman world in the first century? What are some implications that would come from that knowledge of slavery that affect how we read this letter? Anyone?
Can you explain that question again?
Yeah, this was the question about what do you know about, or what are some assumptions about slavery in the first century, and how does that affect our understanding, or part of our lens for understanding this letter, which references slavery, but slavery in the ancient world.
Well, y'all have to I had to breathe a little bit before.
Yeah, this was,
No.
yeah, Dee Dee, this was
It was
basically,
different.
yeah, okay.
Well, it was different. And I was reading even where some people put themselves in slavery. I don't know why, but
Yeah,
some of the reading that I was reading, and it was different. But they were just as mean. They're very mean to their to the slaves.
sure.
Yeah.
And
They
what
treat
would,
them very well.
and yeah, there's, I think no matter what, which era, whether it be ancient or, 150 years ago, or, even slavery in different parts of the world today, there are some key pieces. Yeah, maybe in the ancient world, you could become a slave in different ways. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But all of those have a similarity, don't they? When you no longer, when you are not your own, when somebody owns you, there is something that happens in that relationship, and yeah, it becomes very, very dehumanizing. And I think that's the danger. That's the danger of slavery in any form, that it becomes such a thing that there are those who are fully human and those who are subhuman. And when the people who are in the slave class see themselves as subhuman, that's toxic. But when the people in the owner class see their slaves as subhuman, that's just as toxic to the human spirit, and just as antithetical to the gospel of Jesus, and really the foundational understanding what the Bible says about us as human beings. When we diminish another person's humanity, we are attacking what God has already said in the Bible. And so it becomes really a big problem for us currently, but also I'm sure in the first century too.
When I think of slavery in the first century, I think of Egypt and the Pharaoh, and how him and his people just kind of lounged around, and then the workers kind of whipped the people to build the buildings, and then the slaves kind of were overworked and underappreciated, and that's what I kind of think of when I think of it in the first century.
Yeah, Dee mentioned one of the things that made it a little bit different than in the first century in the Roman world, as opposed to what we think of either as Egyptian slavery, ancient slavery, or what we have experienced in our country, in our history. And that is the idea that slavery for Rome wasn't necessarily a racial thing. And you could enter into it for different reasons. You might be born into it. You might have been captured from another culture, another kingdom, another part of the world, and brought back to Rome to serve as a slave. You could potentially get yourself into debt and have no other option but to give yourself over into a time of slavery, kind of an indentured slavery, which we've heard of that in other times in our history, but where you're actually giving yourself into that relationship for X amount of time to pay off X amount of debt, or the others. And that's probably the main one that would get people into slavery. That's indeed, if you're wondering why would someone do that, it was a way of survival. Maybe not in a spiritual, surviving, thriving way, but it was I have no other way. I've made such a mess of my life that the only way I'm going to be able to pay off this debt and maybe provide for my family would be to give myself into a slave relationship. And so people would do that, again, looking at ways of trying to provide for those they loved. But but again, we have no way of knowing why Philemon is a slave or was a slave. We just know that sometimes when we think of the term slave, it's not exactly the same as it was in the first century, but there were parts of it that are still going to be in play. For example, I know that if a slave were to run away, that would be a bad thing in the eyes of the owner, right? There would be rules and laws against that by the Roman Empire, because they want to keep the status quo operating and they want to keep their economic engine functioning. And if slavery is part of that, they don't want slaves just getting tired of working and going off on their own. They're going to have rules, laws, punishments, which come from someone breaking that bond. And so it's in that context that I think we need to see this letter to Philemon. What's going on here? Philemon clearly, Philemon is clearly a slave or a former slave or a runaway slave. And I guess in the eyes of the state, a runaway slave would still be a slave even if he's not home. So what is Paul getting after here? Because it's clearly he's asking a big ask of Philemon. So go ahead, Dee Dee, you're going to say?
She muted.
No, it's okay. I didn't have anything to say.
Okay.
I actually did some research.
Mm-hmm.
My uncle is part of the Mormon church, and
Okay.
I called him frustrated with this letter, and I said, I don't know. I mean, I have so many questions. Can you answer some of them for me? And he said, of course. Let's talk about it. And I was like, who's this Paul guy?
Uh-huh.
And he's like, well, Paul used to be Saul, and Saul was a man that was with the Romans, and they hunted Christians and killed them.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, oh, so he was literally in prison. And he was like, oh yeah, because he went blind when he was going to Damascus, or can't remember.
Damascus, you got it. Yep.
And he was going blind. He went blind. The Lord took his sight. And when he got to Damascus, the Lord gave him his sight back, and he was a believer of, Jesus Christ and all this stuff. And so he went behind the Romans' back and started preaching about Jesus Christ and the Lord and all this stuff. And he says, oh yeah, they threw him in jail, and I think they even cut his head off. And I said, no way. And so having that understanding, and I feel like I don't know who Philemon is. I'm not very educated about people in the Bible, so I feel like that was a good benefit for me. But I think that Philemon may have been like Paul. I don't know. I think he may have been like Paul. And he says, I know the things that you've done, and God's seen the things that you've done, and he sees what I've done.
Mm-hmm.
I'm his prisoner now because I did his doings. The story was so more in depth, like it makes me want to just find out more about all these people.
Okay, well, let me give you a little pointer. This would be something that won't affect your grade, most likely, although it might. You never know. In the Bible, there's a book called the Book of Acts, and the second half of the Book of Acts is all about the life of Paul, and everything that your uncle told you about his name actually originally being Saul and his role being a persecutor of Christians is all true, and his conversion in Damascus when he came to know Jesus and for a time lost his sight and the whole bit, that is all true. Now what happens to him after that is he begins to tell people about Jesus, and he becomes probably the most authoritative person in the church of that era, and so he really goes from a zero to a hero in no time. And so the Paul that we're dealing with here in Philemon is Paul now a number of years later, with all the respect of being the leader in the church. He is writing to his friend Philemon, who is probably at the church in a town called Colossae. And that was a community in the ancient world in what is present day Turkey The letter that Paul wrote to the Colossians is a letter to that same community, because that's what people from Colossae were called. They were called Colossians. And so Philemon is probably a part of that church. In fact, he is probably a leader in that church. Probably is a man with some status. Why would I say he has status or wealth? What would be some clues that says that he is a man of either some status or wealth? Anyone from the reading of this book, what you might discern?
Well, go ahead, Kayla.
You share?
Yes.
Okay. In the letter, it says that people liked him in so many words, and that they were happy with him. So that kind of gives him some kind of status that people know of him, and that they like him, and that he's a likable person, and that even Paul even talks about like I'm glad you're having a great time, in this church, and that people like you, kind of thing. So that's kind of what kind of hinted status to me, I guess.
Okay.
Likable.
Okay, good. Anybody else?
Maybe too that he held services in his home.
Okay,
So
good.
he had
Yeah.
a home to do that too. So I think that made him a leader.
Yeah.
It's in his home. So
Good. Yeah, those are good. Those are both good clues, both because you're right, Kayla. Paul does take a good bit of time in those first few verses to really talk about the good report, the good reputation that Philemon has, and the way that he encourages so many people. And you're right, Dee Dee, there's a couple of things here. One, the church is meeting in his house, which means one, he probably has one of the larger houses in the community. One that could have a gathering of however big this church was. Frankly, not everyone would have a home that could sustain that, but Philemon does. So you get a hint. It's not for sure, but you get that hint. And otherwise, you say, okay, he probably has some wealth, because if Onesimus ran away from him, that means he owned at least one and maybe many slaves. And again, that would reveal that he has some economic power, that he's got not only a nice house, but he also probably has slaves in his
I turned your camera off.
at his home.
Yeah, I turned it on. Come here. I don't want the camera on.
So
I'm sorry. I thought I was
you're
muted.
okay. Go ahead, Dee
My
Dee.
husband has a meeting and he's not into his Zoom. I'll try to get him on Zoom.
Well, go ahead and mute and give him a hand. There you go.
Okay, right back.
But those are again some of the key components to a little bit of who Philemon is. But if you were to read through Melissa, the book of Colossians, you'd see some of these names again, though not Philemon himself. If you were to read through that book of Acts, which talks about some of Paul's travels and some of the churches he works with, you come across the time when he went to Colossae and began the church there. But Philemon isn't mentioned by name. So for you to say, well, I don't really know, who this guy is. Well, there's a reason, because he is in the bigger picture of the Bible. He's not a big player, Philemon. He is a big player in this little piece, but this is a really small piece of the bigger picture of the Bible. So Paul is a big player because he is all over the New Testament, and he is all over the book of Acts, which is that first generation of believers. And so if you want to read about Paul's story, you will get some little hints in a minute about his role and why he was so important, because he was the one who started so many of these churches, became the one who launched the work of the Christian churches in all these places, like Colossae, where Philemon lived and served and was a leader in the church. So, but that's, again, whether you're looking at the historical world or looking at the literary world, those are good questions to ask. Who are these people? And again, some of the questions you ask, what is their relationship together? Why does Paul speak so glowingly of Philemon? Why does Paul speak so glowingly of Onesimus to Philemon? What are their relationships? If it is a slave, a runaway slave owner relationship with those two, what is Paul trying to accomplish here? And what is his relationship? How is it different with Philemon? How is it different with Onesimus? And And what is this new relationship now that Paul is talking about? And how does that new relationship that Philemon has, that Onesimus has with Paul, how does that change the relationship that Onesimus has with Philemon? And so those become, I think, some of the interesting questions around, so what is Paul asking? Because he's not real blunt, he's not real clear. He says whatever he's asking, he could demand it, but he's not going to demand it. He's just going to ask so that whatever Philemon does, he does it voluntarily. And then later on he says, and I know that even what I'm asking, you're going to do even more. And so what is that? What is it that Paul is getting after? What is it that Philemon, as he reads this, or as it's read for him at church in front of all of his community, what is it that he is being kind of impressed by? Now, again, that's important. I think that the letter was written to Philemon, right? But not just to Philemon. At the beginning of the letter, it is written to Philemon and to Apphia and Archippus and the church that meets in your home. Why does Paul do that? Why write a private letter to somebody, but then have everyone around also get a chance to read it? What's Paul after? Dee?
Maybe to give Philemon to make the right choice. Like, these are the people you're teaching. And so be an example to your teaching. And kind of pressure to me.
A little peer pressure?
To get him to say, what he wants. If you really look at it, he really didn't give him a choice.
Yeah.
Not really.
Yeah, not really. I mean,
No.
yeah. If you consider me your partner, you will do this.
Right.
I guess you could not do it, but if you don't do it,
then
you're kind of not my partner anymore.
right.
And so what does that, what does that mean? It's interesting, isn't it? It is an interesting little arm twisting going on, maybe. But that's a good catch though too, because maybe he's doing it to put pressure on him, so that not only does Philemon have to now be held accountable by Paul, but that everyone who hears the letter, everyone around him, knows what Paul's asking. And so in a way, Philemon is accountable now to them too. It's kind of like sending somebody an email, but CCing it to everybody so that everybody else knows what's going on.
Right.
That group chat or group email.
Yes, that one that's directed right at you, but everyone else gets brought into it. Yeah, and that's probably what Philemon is saying. He's like, "Come on, Paul, give me a break. Don't call me out in front of everybody." But he does, and so so that's a question to ask too. Why? Is it so that Philemon, because Paul knows Philemon's going to do the right thing, and so this is the chance to say, everybody, watch Philemon. This is the right thing. Or is it because he's doubtful that Philemon would do the right thing, so he's putting pressure on him or putting accountability structures in place so that Philemon has to do the right thing? You can read it either way, and it reads a little differently depending on how you want to look at it. But it's an interesting part of this letter, kind of unique actually for really for the New Testament, because there usually isn't this kind of an argument in the midst of one of Paul's letters. But we see this again. So the question to get after is just to walk through, look at those relations, look at how they speak about one another. One of the key questions in the literary world is asking what kind of language does Paul use about himself? I mean, when he refers to himself as an old man, is he being a little dismissive of himself, or a little humble, or is he, pointing to the wisdom that an old man would have, and what's the word? I'm losing my vocabulary tonight.
I think it has something to do with like
Respect,
right? Like,
Yeah.
you know my story, you've seen what I've gone through.
Mhm.
I'm sure a lot of people, especially in the Roman community and in the Catholic community, knew who Paul was and his story, and how, sorry, there's a train, and how Jesus changed everything, and for him. And I feel like he's saying, you've seen my life. I've seen it all, and maybe I'm telling you something that should be worth listening to.
Yeah. Good point. Okay, and okay, and so how does he use that kind of language about himself? When he refers to Philemon as his dear brother or partner, you know, that says something about their relationship, what kind of relationship they have, that idea of mutuality, or however you want to see that. When Paul refers to Onesimus as his son, how else does he refer to Onesimus?
Also, a
Yeah.
brother also.
Brother also, right?
In Christ, in the church.
Mhm.
Because he wants him to receive him as a brother in Christ also.
Right. So
in the
Onesimus-
gospel, rather. Yeah.
Yep. So again, so notice that again, there's certainly a hierarchy when it comes to slavery. There's owners and there are slaves, but Paul doesn't use that hierarchy language, does he? He's intentional to avoid that. And there's a reason for that. So, you know, he is trying to make his argument all the more persuasive because he's kind of creating a new worldview for Philemon to see through. So, so again, interesting use of the way he uses language and the way he uses words to describe himself, as well as the other two main characters in the story. And then there are these weird little funny parts, aren't there? Things like, oh, by the way, I hope to come and visit you soon. So make sure and have a guest room prepared for me. Is that just, you know, a little quirk that was reminds us that it was a private letter from one individual to another individual? Or is it, again, part of that manipulation that Dee Dee was talking about, that pressure? I'm asking you this big ask, expecting you're going to do it, but just in case you were thinking about not doing it, I do plan to come and visit. So, you know, there's some kind of fun that goes along in this letter. And I'm not sure all of Paul's motives, but as part of your role is to kind of try to really hash it out and say, what do I think is happening in this letter? So again, if you haven't had a chance to look at the contemporary world questions or the literary world questions this week, I encourage you to do so. And then get those assignments in here by the weekend so that I have a chance to maybe get them back to you if at all possible. I will be probably less available early next week for a while. My family and I are going to be away on a little vacation. So when I Zoom with you, next Thursday night, you will not see these bricks in the background. You will see some lovely tropical destination in the back. So there you go. I'll tell you more about it when I see you guys next Thursday. But as you can, get those assignments in and we'll get a chance to give you a little bit of feedback. Go ahead, Melissa.
On the contemporary world submission, it asks kind of like a second half, it looks like, and it's asking for a thesis statement and another question. Do you want our thesis statement or?
You know, yes and no. I mean, I don't need it. Really more important, I think, is that you're wrestling with the questions that are there. But if you throw out a thesis statement, you know, this is what I think the book of Philemon is about. That gives me a chance to at least be able to say, yeah, I think you're right on it. That seems, I can see where you're going with that. Or, wow, I've never heard of that. Are you sure you're reading the same book I am? But I'll give you a lot of room for how you understand the book, you know, but I do want you to make sure you're on, you know, oh, this is about forgiveness, you know, or something, you know. Yeah, so it's helpful. I won't grade you on what you say it is, but if I give you some feedback, it might be helpful.
Okay,
Okay.
That's all I wanted to know.
Yeah. Yes, Kayla.
When is the last day to turn everything in?
Okay, the last day for this class is, let me get it right, is Sunday night. Everything except for the signature assignment. So let me take a look at a calendar here, Kayla, and I'll give you a good answer here.
Thank you so much.
So yeah, so the last night for everything but signature assignment is going to be the 21st of February. And then the 21st of February is 3 days after, or excuse me, then the signature assignments do 3 days after that last day. So it would be on the 24th of February is when the signature assignments are due, no later than the 24th of February.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so roughly 2 weeks until the signature
God.
signature assignment is due 2 weeks from yesterday.
Got it.
Got it.
I'm writing it all down right now.
Okay,
Thank you.
you're very welcome. And
Yeah.
you can do it,
Before-
Dee Dee. You can do
before
it.
midnight?
You know, it just takes me so long because
Yes.
I can't myself. I'm an overthinker. And so
Mhm.
I don't know. So it just take me a while. Like I
Okay.
write stuff and I erase it and start all over again. Because
Mhm.
like, surely it don't mean that. And they're like, maybe it means this. And so I just keep on. And so, yeah. No,
Okay.
it is a struggle.
Yeah. Okay, well, keep on. Keep
But
on.
it's okay.
I'm
Okay.
sure of my I'm
Huh?
sure of my answer, but the 5 pages does not include the cover sheet or the signature or the reference. Well, we don't have a reference page, but it doesn't include the cover sheet.
That is correct.
Okay, I'm
Yes.
just making sure.
Yes,
You
thank
said
you
it
for,
does or
thank you
doesn't?
for, it does not.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, that's kind of assumed, but you're right. That's better we state it than have you go into it saying, oh, there's page 1. I'll start on page 2 now. Yeah. Okay.
I had a question, but I can't find it. So it's okay.
Okay.
So
well,
a cover
Go ahead.
page, no reference page, and then 5 to 7 pages altogether.
correct.
I just have to say it because if not, then
Mhm.
thank you.
Now, you can have a reference page, but you don't have to have a reference page. But if you are referring to other works, quoting other people, other outside of the Bible, then you need to reference them. But there's no requirement to go to outside works for this assignment.
Awesome.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. I had a question, but I think I could figure it out.
Okay.
You know.
If you're sure.
Well, yeah, it was just on what we've already talked about, but I can't. Oh yeah, the contemporary world of
Philemon.
Philemon. The questions contemporary world application using various specific examples. Are you talking about using? And it says what classroom sources can you use? Are you talking about the books that we have?
Yes, exactly.
Uh,
Yeah, we're talking about a classroom for this course, not classroom like in
Like any
your
other books we have.
classroom. Right.
This class.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
but anything from anything, and again, we don't expect a whole lot. Again, not looking for outside references. Like you don't have to quote from Fee and Stewart, how to read the Bible for all it's worth. It's really about, but again, if you want to use some of the pattern, that idea, the 3 worlds of looking at it from historical point of view, looking at some of what you believe you see in the literary world, those are helpful things. But you don't have to be quoting, in Fee and Stewart, he talks about exegesis, and that's what I'm about to do. You don't need to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You are very welcome.
So some of the other work we did, are we going to get some grades back on anything?
Yeah, you will. And like I say, especially as we move through the 3 worlds, contemporary world, historical world, literary world, but the other ones you should be seeing grades coming up real soon too.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Well,
All right.
thank you. Yes, thank you very much. And I will shoot me an email if you have any need for anything else, but otherwise we'll see you guys next Thursday night. And Kayla, really glad that you are back with us.
Yay.
And again, a little early happy birthday to you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you,
Happy
Professor.
birthday. Yay. You look good, by the way.
She does, doesn't she?
You look really
Thank
good. You look really good.
I feel my strength slowly coming back, and I got light in my eyes now.
Yeah,
There you
she-
go. You look
Hell.
good. Okay. Very
All right.
good.
Well, good night to all of you and have a
Okay.
great week.
Well, good night. Same to you.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye-bye.